So good afternoon, and welcome to this year's Meiklejohn Lecture on the changing ecosystem of news and challenges to freedom of the press with Professor Martha Minow, the Carter Professor of General Jurisprudence from Harvard Law School. I'm Susan Moffett. I'm the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy here at the Watson Institute. Welcome, welcome, welcome all. So this lecture was named for civil libertarian, Brown alumnus, and former dean of Brown, Alexander Meiklejohn. And we hold it every year to discuss some topic related to the Constitution and matters of freedom. And this year we're delighted to have Professor Minow join us to talk with us about freedom of the press. A keen observer of law and how it works in action and how it affects the everyday lives of real people. Professor Minow is an expert in constitutional law, on human rights, on international criminal justice, and civil procedure. Her extensive scholarship has opened up new terrain in the study of rights of racial and religious minorities, the rights of women, the rights of persons with disabilities, the rights of children. Also, her work on privatization, on military justice, and ethnic and religious conflict. Her vast scholarship, as you know, includes many books, a few of which include In Brown's Wake, Legacies of America's Constitutional Landmark, Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, Facing History After Genocide and Mass Violence, and Making All the Difference, Inclusion, Exclusion, and American Law. Professor Minow served as Dean of Harvard Law School from 2009 to 2017. She presently serves on the board of CBS and serves as Vice Chair of the Legal Services Corporation. She previously founded the Imagine Coexistence Project with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and among her many, many awards and honors, she has received 9 honorary degrees, the Sargent Shriver Equal Justice Award, and she has been was awarded a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1992. Thank you so much for coming. And moderating today's conversation is Professor Corey Bretschneider, Professor of Political Science here at Brown University. Corey's work examines the intersection of constitutional law and democratic theory. He's the author of many influential books and articles, 4 books, with yet another on the way out later this year, currently titled The Oath and the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents. Thanks for moderating tonight, Corey. Timely indeed, as is the changing ecosystem of news. So our time together will unfold in the following way. Professor Minow will begin with some remarks, about 30 to 40 minutes, and then she and Professor Bretschneider will engage in some conversation for another 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will open it up for your questions. We are a very full house tonight, which is wonderful, but it means we should all be mindful of our airtime, including me. So when you ask a question, please ask one direct question and then share the air with your colleagues. For those of you who are joining us in the overflow room, there is someone there who will let you know how to convey questions down to me, which I can then ask Professor Minow on your behalf down here in the Joukowsky Forum. We'll wrap up around 5:15, and then I would invite you to join us all in the foyer of the Watson Institute for a reception and to continue our conversation. So now you please join me in very warmly welcoming Professor Martha Minow.
Thank you so much, Susan. So Susan called me and invited me to do this just as I was stepping down as dean. And it was about a week after my first board meeting on CBS. And the confluence couldn't have been better. Although my sign by my phone says, just say no, and I'm not saying yes to anything, this was too much of a gift to be invited to come here and be with you and to have the chance to think about something that I just have begun to think about. And also to do so in the context of Alexander Meiklejohn, whose legendary work has influenced so many generations of thinkers about free speech. So, the ecosystem of news. It has changed beyond the imagination of anyone living at the time that the First Amendment was drafted. The changes include changes in the private industry of the press. It has resulted in some communities in this country having literally no news coverage. A majority of the people in this country now receive news selected for them by computer-based algorithms based on their past interests, which in turn produce echo chambers with fewer opportunities to learn, understand, or believe what others are hearing as news. Traditional news media, which I've learned are called the legacy media, are shrinking, cutting staff, and relying on freelancers as the digital platforms surge and target users, we're users, we're not readers, and contribute to a world in which fewer than 1/3 of those who were surveyed recently trust mass media to report news fully and accurately, the lowest number since surveying began. The recent indictment of 13 Russians for disrupting the 2016 U.S. presidential election by spreading divisive and false messages through Facebook, Google, and Twitter underscores what Alexander Meiklejohn expressed so well. Reliable press expression is fundamental to democratic self-governance. What can be done when transformations in the technology, the economics, and communications jeopardize the production, distribution, and trust in news that is essential in a democratic society? Tackling this question means acknowledging a basic fact. The freedom of the press defended in the First Amendment by the United States Constitution assumes the existence and durability of a private industry. I don't think there's any other right in the Constitution that does that. In directing that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press, the authors assumed the existence of newspapers. They then were produced on privately owned printing presses, published accounts of the events of the day, political opinions, essays, and perhaps entertainment for readers. Constitutional protections for that work could have fallen comfortably within the other clause in the First Amendment protecting speech, the freedom of speech, but the authors thought it important enough to single out the press and did so as a bulwark for the liberty of the people in their vision of self-government. The particular shift from printing presses to tubes and fibers should not matter. Jeopardy to the very project of gathering and sharing news, that's what matters. It's not surprising now to hear an astute observer warn, news as we know it is at risk, so is democratic governance, which depends on an effective watchdog news media. These are the words of former Washington Post journalist Robert Kaiser, and he said it in 2014. So that's a light year away from the president in the terms of the political and media developments of this country. I'm going to try to describe the current news ecosystem and the multiple and varied trends, consider what's new about it. We've had disruptions in the past, and what are the resulting vulnerabilities and maybe constitutional implications and steps to proceed. How many of you get your news from a hard copy newspaper? You are atypical. How many from radio or television? Okay. And how many from websites? All right, now it's looking like the rest of the world. And how many from social media? Okay. Reuters found recently that 2/3 of those surveyed in 26 countries around the world rely on social media for their news. More people find their news through an online algorithm than through human editors. Only 1 in 10 of those surveyed pay anything for online news. People massively rely on apps and social media, and already in 2002, again, light years away, only 2 out of 10 people relied on print newspapers. That was quite a while ago. And only 5% in the age group of 18 to 29 get their news from print newspapers. Newspapers, as a result, are not doing so well, and they're cutting. They're cutting staff, they're shrinking coverage. More than 100 newspapers have shifted from daily to weekly, and between 2004 and 2014, at least 664 newspapers shut down. Unbundling is another change. People can now get their updates on sports or weather quite apart from their political news, further decreasing the cross-subsidies that news and even news and entertainment once were able to use. The for-profit model of newspapers has been supported largely by advertising in the history of the United States. It doesn't work anymore. 89% of the advertising dollars go to Google or Facebook. This is a change. For 4 decades after World War II, mainstream journalism reflected a mission of non-ideological reporting about politics, foreign affairs, business, entertainment, and especially major network news helped to unify the country, certainly between the 1950s and 1970s, and provide criticism of government excesses. It wasn't perfect. It was always a range of quality and political slants. And real-time access now to reports from news media around the world is far better than what was available in the past. But now, the great institutions on which we've depended for news in the world may not survive. The trends are complex. Different dynamics are at work in local communities compared with large cities and national markets. And for people sorted by race, age, education level. There's in some ways been less disruption for small newspapers by the national digital platforms than for bigger news operations. But what's happening with the small newspapers is consolidation of ownership and cost cutting that has diminished local news, local reporting. Over the past 20 years, newspapers across the country lost 40% of their daily circulation. And in the past 10 years, advertising revenues decreased 63%. Since the election of President Donald Trump, there have been new subscribers for 2 newspapers, the New York Times and Washington Post, bringing their numbers to a record level and some degree of sustaining revenues. But 25% of those surveyed in the country in the last year say they think that there's a problem and they want to find a way to support the funding of news. About 60% of newspaper jobs in the United States vanished recently. Smaller newspapers also face mergers, and the mergers, either to chains or private equity, mean that there is now in control people who are pursuing economic returns as their primary goal, and they're looking for cost savings, often by shutting down papers or by having the reduction from daily to weekly, or one other technique is to have the same story printed in local newspapers across a whole region. So it's not local news, really. In the past, there was concentrated ownership, the Knight Ridder and Times Mirror chains, and in some ways they elevated the quality of some local news outlets, but they ended up making serious cuts before both of those went out of business and had to sell. And investment-focused owners are actually producing what is an unprecedented level of consolidation. The owners who own many products may actually be seeking more generic material and focus on stories that will trend. How about that for a verb? Rather than provide the kind of news that people need in order to govern themselves. Publicly traded companies holding many newspapers have to get a profit, and they are looking for a bigger profit. Indeed, my hometown newspaper, grew up in Chicago, the Chicago Tribune, recently had to sell, even though it was profitable, but it wasn't a big enough profit for what the investors wanted. And what do people need? People need, you know this, you need news about local politicians, about economic matters, about environmental issues, how to deal with your credit cards and mortgages, about what's happening in the local school board. That's not being covered in a lot of communities. Some nonprofit news organizations are emerging. Some communities offer reports of governmental and business actions, but many of these are supported by philanthropy or volunteerism, and they are all struggling. You can't go to a journalism conference without the central topic being, what is the sustainable business model? The entire business model of newspapers is very much in free fall. People are reluctant to pay for news. Maybe it was a mistake. The legacy news organizations put their content online for free, and now people don't want to pay for it, even though they pay more for their lattes than they do for the news. A few prestigious newspapers have found wealthy investors, Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post. Patrick Soon-Shiang bought the LA Times and San Diego Union Tribune, and Laurene Powell Jobs and some partners bought the Atlantic. This is putting very wealthy people in the role of treating news as a philanthropy. And the people that I've mentioned are taking it seriously. They're leaving their editorial decisions to professionals, but others may not, and others may seek to influence the tilt of the news or change it in other ways. The Mercer family is controlling Breitbart. Charles and David Koch's pursuit of media ownership and Rupert Murdoch's media, it's not about their difference in politics with some others, is that their goal is to influence the politics. It's a different idea about what the enterprise is rather than a philanthropy of keeping the news going. Broadcasting and cable similarly has consolidation that has a risk of diminishing local news, may reduce diversity of opinion and viewpoint. Sinclair is one company that owns currently 173 television stations. And if the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, approves its plan to purchase 42 more stations, it will end up owning the broadcasting for 3/4 of American households. Such concentrated ownership displaces local control, and it shifts editorial decisions to people who don't have a stake in the local community. Meanwhile, older people, like me, reminisce about the golden age of television news. Now, I'm not quite old enough to remember Edward R. Murrow when he reported on the scenes of war and met the Red Scare led by Senator Joseph McCarthy with courage, but I do remember Walter Cronkite. Anybody else? Okay, so Walter Cronkite narrated moon launches, right? Assassinations, political conventions, the Vietnam War. There's not a single person in the news industry who plays that role anymore because there's no one who has that kind of readership or viewership. The new competition grows with streaming devices and digital platforms, Amazon, YouTube, Netflix being prime among them, Twitter also. It's an example of what law professor Frank Pasquale calls the black box society, because the data platforms customize people's access to news and sports and entertainment and other content without asking them and without offering choices, but instead reflecting on what they've read before. As one service said explicitly in its launch, the feature delivers a way to browse and discover news from publishers worldwide and introduces a personalized newscast through a filter bubble. This is the ad. Through a filter bubble that adapts to your interests based on what programming you watch and what you skip. In sum, these big shifts arise with three big trends. Corporate investors giving greater priority to financial returns and to quality journalism, or even maintaining particular local news outlets. Wealthy individuals as investors who may support independent journalism or may not, and the shift of advertising dollars to online media platforms, but even more online digital platforms that are not even in the news or entertainment business per se. They're in the data business, and we are the product. It is our data that they use and they sell. What are the results? The results include loss of government accountability, like reporting on the excessive reliance on fines and fees by the courts in Ferguson, Missouri, where the police shooting of Michael Brown triggered racial riots across the country. Turns out Ferguson, Missouri had no daily newspaper, no news blog focused on local government, no community radio station, no local public access television. Taken together, the trends that I'm describing help to explain shrinking investments in local news and also in professionalized journalism. Leaders at Facebook and Google stress that as tech companies, they're not in the business of journalism. They rely on algorithms rather than human decisions. They're interested in human attention. Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer of Facebook, explained, she said, "We're not a media company. We're a tech company. We hire engineers. We don't hire reporters. No one is a journalist. We don't cover the news." And yet, more and more people get their news through Facebook and other social media. British reporter Emily Bell noted, social media hasn't just swallowed journalism, it has swallowed everything. It has swallowed political campaigns, banking systems, personal histories, the leisure industry, retail, even government and security. Ostensibly neutral platforms are easily manipulated by propagandists and extremists. Not the owners, not the managers, people outside who use the open architecture for their own ends. So, an example, Rodrigo Duterte, the autocratic president of the Philippines. The Philippines is a country in which 97% of the people have accounts on Facebook. Duterte's support from Facebook started when he was a candidate with training sessions that the company provided, and it continued after he reached office with what they called white glove services, tailored to his needs. Along the way, he and his supporters deployed fake accounts, insults, threats of violence, fraudulent endorsements, and in order to consolidate support for his regime. He used Facebook to stream his inauguration after he banned the independent media in the Philippines from covering it. Facebook, in turn, has entered into a partnership to lay undersea cables to support users in the Philippines and allowed critics of Duterte to be removed by Facebook. While leaders of digital services have claimed that they're passive intermediaries treating everyone the same, the critics charge that the tools and the architecture that they've set up allows abuses. And such charges have not produced verdicts in lawsuits around this country, lawsuits brought against Facebook, Twitter, and Google. They avoid civil liability despite charges that their tools assist terrorists like Hamas. And again, the companies say they're not responsible for what's on their platforms. They're neutral, they're just providing a space. Their tools, of course, we all now know, are easily used to spread misinformation and fraudulent content. And the 13 Russians indicted by Robert Mueller is just, I think, the tip of the iceberg. The role played by digital platforms in misinformation and propaganda grows from the sheer number of people who are engaged. The use of algorithms to accelerate the spread of materials that attract attention is at the core of their business model. Readers are often vulnerable to hoaxes and abuses, in part because these companies hire people to make sure that people get addicted to the digital service. They hire psychologists to actually play into our tendency to look at the discrepant, to look at the most controversial. And they try to maximize this notion of engagement. And one example is dark ads. These are ads that are invisible to all but those who are targeted, and they don't reveal who paid for them. Oxford University scholars call this computational propaganda. Activists who use digital media to nudge voter turnout understand something about the psychology, but it obviously can be used for many, many other purposes. Clickbait is the concept. Arresting headlines and ads that draw attention, that draw rubbernecking. They enable a surprising amount of disinformation without the checks of counterspeech or investigation. Digital platforms can engage in what some people have called digital gerrymandering, selectively presenting information to serve interests that are unknown to the recipients and undisclosed to the world. Facebook, for example, has now added new staff to police the hate speech and take down fake accounts, but no one thinks those efforts are working very well. And the risks of chaos and misinformation continue. According to a recent poll, nearly half of registered U.S. voters believe that major news organizations make up stories about Donald Trump. And maybe the distrust of the news and media is just part of a larger trend. People distrust anyone with authority, anyone with expertise. But it may also have something to do with utter failures of governance. So, for example, the Federal Election Commission, which is charged with regulating election-related speech, has been in a deadlock for about a decade, unable to issue any rules that govern the election-related speech or the conduct of these digital platforms, whether or not they need to disclose the payment source, for example, of the ads. Individuals who present themselves anonymously online and give no clue about their funding actually shatter basic norms about the possibility of a marketplace of ideas where people can actually engage with each other directly. YouTube recently promoted a conspiratorial video accusing one of the survivors of the mass shooting in Florida's Stoneman Douglas High School of being an actor who did not attend the school. I don't know if you heard about that. YouTube later explained that they'd made a mistake. They misclassified the video. Meantime, it was viewed by 200,000 people and picked up in all major news outlets as trending. YouTube's algorithms tend to recommend channels that advance conspiracy theories and falsehoods even to people who have never shown an interest in such content. We don't know what the algorithms say and why it has this effect, but it does. President Trump has made fake news a popular phrase, and disagreements over its meaning simply amplify doubt and distrust towards provider of news. Competition for shrinking audiences are troubling even mainstream media, and so they are turning to sensational headlines or human interest stories. And at the same time, technological and economic disruption alter how news is gathered, edited, assessed, distributed, and financed. It contributes to the diminishing role of facts and analysis in America. This is the new ecosystem of news. So what does the First Amendment have to do with any of this? Well, the framers of the Bill of Rights assumed the existence of the private press in guaranteeing its freedom, and at the same time, in varied ways, less obvious, I think, the federal government has actually bolstered, subsidized, supported, and shaped the media that have delivered news for the last several hundred years. Government has invested in the development of new media. It has shielded innovative media from competition. It has enforced competition rules in order to promote access and innovation. The government's not neutral about this current ecosystem. The government's fingerprints are all over it, and the transformation of media from printing presses to the internet involves both the ingenuity of private enterprise and conscious governmental policies. Both have been crucial to the operation of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So let me just fill this out a little bit. The framers of the Constitution understood there'd be difficulties with news. James Madison saw public opinion as the real sovereign of society, but in a large society, he said, public opinion is less easy to be ascertained and less difficult to be counterfeited. Less difficult to be counterfeited. Accordingly, he said it'd be crucial to ensure a general intercourse of sentiments, including roads and commerce and a free press and a circulation of newspapers through the entire body of people. These are the preconditions for the Republican form of government guaranteed by the Constitution. Warnings that the news industry would be in trouble have been around for a long time. They recur periodically. And repeatedly, technological change has disrupted how people get news, how people get entertainment. The idea of objective news is relatively recent, really the turn of the 20th century. And professional journalism really, again, developed only towards the latter part of the 19th century. Private sector companies are critical, but it's also the case that American governmental investments have been critical. So just as an example, from the beginning, the post office subsidized the circulation of newspapers, lower rate for newspapers. And in fact, from the beginning, newspapers were given free delivery to another newspaper so that there would be circulation among the news industry about the news. It's also the case that Congress refrained from taxing newspapers, which could have been a killer. And in fact, that was one of the instigations of the revolution, right? The Stamp Act was one of the reasons that there was a revolt. The idea that printing presses would have to actually pay a tax. And that has been part of governmental policy from the beginning. In fact, in the 1930s, when some localities started to tax newspapers, the Supreme Court struck it down as a violation of the First Amendment. So the First Amendment has been interpreted to support this structure of subsidy for the media. Active campaigns for fledgling civil liberties built a constitutional doctrine starting in the 1920s protecting freedom of speech and expanding it and protecting the newspapers. But there are other sources of law here that have absolutely shaped the ecosystem of news. One is the briefly, but for a time, important doctrine, the fairness doctrine, that mandated that broadcast networks provide contrasting news on issues of public importance. And it was predicated on the idea of broadcast signals being scarce. So when cable came in, the fairness doctrine was abandoned. But that's an example of a policy that was found to be perfectly compatible with the First Amendment. Telegraph. The telegraph grew with governmental support and governmental policies. The government gave free land for the setup for the telegraph. And in fact, the telegraph spread much more quickly in the United States than it did in other countries where it was run by the government. Antitrust policy, another crucial tool used by the government to promote, at times, competition, at times, permission for monopoly and regulation accordingly. For example, with the telephone industry, for a long time, to make sure that there was telephone service across the country. It was a protected monopoly with regulation. And then a decision in the 1980s to break it up absolutely transformed the nature of the very wires on which the internet is delivered in many, many homes. So are the disruptions that we are experiencing now different in kind from the disruptions of the telegraph, the radio, television, cable? Here's one way in which it's different. The problem from looking at the First Amendment point of view is not the dangers of over-regulation of the government curtailing speech. Rather, it's the swamping of information and journalistic values by propaganda, memes, and ads, and the lack of protection for the consumer of the news. It's the inaction by the government, and also the government's involvement in setting up the structure that we currently have. So I could talk in more details about ways in which I think that the world is different, but let's just get really concrete about this. When I use my cell phone to send a message or receive updates from CNN or what have you, it's working by sending a packet of data through a network using an internet service provider, such as Verizon, AT&T, and Comcast. And ultimately, the chain translates the message back into a text as it reaches another device. If the internet service providers do not treat all the packets the same, those who have more money or influence, or those who are favored by a controlling government or controlling company will be able to have faster speed or better rates. When I use the internet, I'm using a device, my phone or a tablet or a laptop computer, and I'm linking this hardware to other hardware like an Ethernet network card or modem connected to an electronic cable or wireless transmission of radio waves or a beam of light set down by fiber optic glass tube, all of which require large investments of capital, private enterprise, competition in each of those domains, but also government structuring of the markets in each of those areas. The business and architecture of each of these affects whether and how people receive or create information. And the holding by a few dominant companies of the bulk of this structure has raised new concerns about concentrated and unaccountable power. Further complicating all of this is just the sheer complexity. I mean, to write that paragraph, that was hard. To understand it, still not there, working on it. And the confusion that all of us experience all the time, to know the difference between a sponsored post versus news. It's not by accident that they make that print really, really small or in a color that you can't see. And what other techniques are available for misuse? The algorithms, the machine learning and other use of algorithms that are meant to connect people are not transparent. We don't understand what's going into it and what's going out of it. Companies that do this work are getting a lot of complaints. People say, I'm not getting my emails as fast as I used to. And some investigations have disclosed that actually there are some manipulations about some of these wires that affect who gets what and where and how. We don't know enough about it. We need to know more. Facebook used some interesting techniques to alter the news feeds of 2 million politically engaged people as part of an experiment. They were sent a higher proportion of hard news instead of cat videos and so forth. And when their friends shared a news story, it showed up higher in their news feed without anyone telling them that this was a result of an experiment that Facebook was running. And they could run other experiments without telling us, and I'm sure that they do. Whether carefully designed or reflecting unconscious bias, the algorithms govern the work of the digital platforms. They collect vast amounts of information. And the visibility problem, I think, is not going to get people organized to have a protest, but it's pretty real and pretty serious. Russian and Macedonian actors pretending to be Americans are a transborder threat to democracy, no less than cyber hacking threatens American businesses. And the internet is vulnerable to what Tim Wu calls flooding. An enormous volume of information drowns out disfavored speech and discredits mainstream media sources or distracts people from them. And it's often done by robots. So what would Meiklejohn do? At this time, the First Amendment, I think, has a new challenge. And the challenge is how to actually become relevant to this moment. Take, for example, the impact of social media when government officials use it to communicate with the public. So this is being done by local city officials all the way to the President of the United States, social media, medium of choice. The social media platforms are themselves private, but government officials are using them as their major way of communicating with constituents and others. The First Amendment does not conventionally regulate the decisions by the private actors. Those are off limits for the constitutional analysis. Only if there's a local, state, or a federal government that's abridging speech or press has the court found a violation. But what if the city council person removes me from the Facebook account because I've been writing critical things? Or the President of the United States does that, removes people from his Twitter feed. These are not hypotheticals. This has happened. Should the First Amendment come into play? This is the challenge. It's a new territory. It has not been addressed. But it does seem to me worth thinking about where these media are the public square and are being used by government officials. I think even more fundamentally, the Constitution can and should play a vital role in exposing how the government enables the current situation. And this should help propel new policies, regulations, and practices. And I have a bunch to suggest, and I will suggest them. But I do so not just as a list of these would be good policy recommendations, because you can do that, that's good policy. But I'm a constitutional law scholar, and I want to say it's not just that these would be nice to haves. I'm going to say we won't have a First Amendment guarantee of freedom of press if we don't do something in these directions. And again, I want to underscore that the government is implicated deeply in the current structure. Just a little bit more example. The internet itself was invented by the government. I know, with a lot of jokes about who invented it, but it really was subsidized by DARPA and ARPANET. It's the precursor. The federal government also guaranteed consumers the right to use modems on their phone lines, could have chosen something else, and prevented telephone companies from undermining the emerging computer network market and required phone companies to share their lines with the competing broadband services to make possible this current ecosystem. After Congress overhauled the telecommunications law in 1996, the Clinton-era FCC required incumbent phone companies to share their lines with competitors, and as interpreted judicially, Congress has worked to promote unfettered speech on the internet. Federal dollars covered at least 50% of the research and development investments in the United States in communications and computer technology. It's not a small contribution. The degree of government responsibility for our media infrastructure should compel government action. to make sure that we have the First Amendment protection of the press that the Constitution anticipated. So here are my suggestions of examples, and then we can get into a discussion. I think we need a new fairness doctrine. The scarcity now is not the scarcity of channels, because we have too many opportunities to get information, but it is the scarcity of human cognition and attention. And providers, in my view, should not be provided to make space for anybody and everyone, but it should allow a searcher to actually find competing views. It should make it easy, and it doesn't do that. And the government requirement could stimulate innovation and feedback by users and observers to help develop better notions of what it means to have competing views. Second, I think that we should treat digital platforms as public utilities or else regulate them. During the 20th century, trust-busting leaders, including Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, pursued regulatory innovations to restore democratic control in the face of concentrated power by private companies. And I think it's just a similar idea. We've done it before. Maintaining an infrastructure of a natural monopoly for public purposes of public utility can be organized and subject to the regulation that advances the public interest. And although there's competition for some aspects of the new media ecosystem, the infrastructure distributing access to the internet is still largely monopolistic. Internet platforms exercise enormous power over transmission, gatekeeping, scoring, that affects all of our lives in so many ways. And in this domain, it should be viewed as a public utility and regulated. What would the regulations address? How about privacy? How about who owns our own data? How about establishing transparency and forms of accountability? How about developing self-regulation of standards that the digital platforms actually then enforce, which they don't do right now? They don't enforce their own user guidelines. That would be a place to go. Security against flooding and harassment, equal access, fair pricing. If you want to talk about net neutrality, we can. That's a subset. That's not, I'm not gonna turn all of my hopes on net neutrality, but that's an example of what public utility status could permit. Third, use antitrust authority. Antitrust enforcement could break apart concentrated ownership and control that have made these powerhouse companies like Facebook and Google immune from pressures to protect consumer interests in a variety of ways. The sheer threat of antitrust enforcement could lead to more responsiveness by digital companies. You know, for a long time, the enemy in mass media was Nazis, then it was insurance companies, now it's internet providers. It's a clue that there might be some concerns. Offering a safe harbor from antitrust concerns for newspapers or broadcasters who associate in order to better survive the new ecosystem would be another kind of antitrust policy, preventing antitrust threats. If some of the now weakened news agencies actually collaborate, would be good. Right now, they're reluctant to do so. Fourth, require communications across software interfaces and access to data for accountability. This is technical, bear with me. Tom Wheeler, former chair of the Federal Communications Commission, wrote about this just last week with Wael Ghonim, the former Google employee who helped to spark the protests behind Arab Spring. They propose using a rule that would require social media platforms to coordinate through an open application programming interface, API for people who like abbreviations. And the basic idea is that it wouldn't steal the secret sauce of the algorithms of the Googles and Facebooks of the world, but it would require the sharing of their programming to third parties that could build software that could monitor it. And as a result, be able to provide one of those crucial functions of a watchdog that the press has done. Such interfaces already exist. That's what allows Google Maps to work with Uber. It's not hard. You can design it to protect the privacy of users. You can design it to protect the secrecy of the algorithms while still making it possible to make sense of who actually purchased an ad and how much they were distributed and where. Fifth, require payment for news circulated on social media. Here's another problem. There's an antitrust problem if the news media get together and say, hey, what if we all get together and start to have a paywall? They violate the antitrust law if they talk to each other about that. And so you have a first mover problem, and it's a serious deterrent to making a shift here. Sixth, regulate fraud. The European Union has been more effective than anything in the United States in getting Facebook and other digital companies to remove fake accounts. And I don't think it's because they're smarter. I think it's because they actually enforce fraud laws. The Supreme Court of the United States has interpreted the First Amendment to provide some breathing room for lies, but the First Amendment has always coexisted from the beginning with laws against defamation, laws against deception. I think we can find a way through the thicket of First Amendment absolutism and still have regulations that guard against fraud. There are sites that entirely traffic in fake information. I think that they could be shut down, and they should be. Seventh, strengthen public media. Despite claims that public broadcasting, national public radio are unnecessary or obsolete, I think they're a crucial part of the information commons and for competition with privately produced news. Surveys actually right now rate public media as the single most trustworthy source of news, and they have done so every year for the past 14 years. Public media could make a difference in addressing the news deserts of local news if they had more resources. They could create a digital platform for community news and information, including a capacity to collect and analyze big data and bring it down locally to local communities. If there are, for example, make up a hypothetical, large mortgage companies that are misusing their power. So, public media. Eighth, non-governmental alternatives, philanthropy, we already have, but I think protecting the tax deduction for philanthropy may be pretty important if that's going to be an important part of this story. In closing, I turn to Alexander Meiklejohn. He inspired this lecture series. He was the first to theorize that the reason for the First Amendment and the reason for the shape that it has is entirely to serve democracy. He had a healthy ability to look forward, not just backward. And he emphasized how much we have to keep open to change. He wrote, and I quote him, "We must accept and applaud the assertion that the Constitution is an experiment in the sense in which all life is an experiment." I say to you, the success of that experiment depends on our ability now to enable, in our rapidly changing world, production, distribution, and trust in news. Otherwise, it won't be around. Thank you.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure especially to, can you hear me? Yeah. To hear the Meiklejohn Lecture touch so closely on Meiklejohn's own work. And that's where I'd like to start my first question. I mean, you're absolutely characterized it beautifully, that for Meiklejohn there is an emphasis on the protection of all viewpoints and protection on the press, but for a purpose. And the underlying purpose is the idea of self-government. Thus, the most famous of his books, Free Speech and its relationship to self-government. But there's another side to this, as you also mentioned in the lecture, and a development both in the technology of media now and also a development in the law that I think cuts against the view that you and I respect so much in Alexander Meiklejohn. So I wanted to ask you a couple questions about just how we would respond to the challenges that are likely to arise from what you rightly call the court's wing of First Amendment free speech absolutists. So the first one, I guess, would worry about the proposals in the following way. They would say, yes, Red Lion said that the Fairness Doctrine was constitutional, but that was a completely different world. It was a world that, you know, as you say, of three networks, and part of the argument was that we want to allow for the breakup of that consolidated power and the ability of people to amplify their voices. And one response might be, well, the diffusion of the internet and the fact that there are so many websites, anybody can amplify their voice, get online and compete for the attention of people. And the worry would be that, you know, the logic basically of Red Lion is gone, and in its place we should have the protection. I guess there's also sort of an intuitive worry that, you know, the idea that Breitbart would be forced to have an opposite view, it sort of messes and might have a chilling effect on the kind of media that we have. So I completely agree with you. I want you to succeed, and I want Meiklejohn to be revived in exactly this way, but I think we should maybe think about that first question. I have a related one.
Right. No, and thanks for doing this, and thanks for that very good question. You know, I think certainly the justifications that were used by the Supreme Court to uphold the fairness doctrine don't hold anymore. We don't have scarcity of outlets. We have a plethora of outlets. And maybe it's too cute, I have to say, but we have a scarcity of human attention. But I don't think we should ignore that. I think that it is the fundamental issue that was behind the rationale, was that the communication channel won't go all the way through. But I think that there's also this experimental idea is absolutely crucial. And if we only, in a small-minded way, just cut and paste what was done in the past and apply it to the present, then we cannot deal with any of the changes of contemporary society, not just in this field, but in any other. And I think even the free speech absolutists in the Supreme Court understand that. As they struggle to deal with new media, then the analogies simply don't work. So I think that we need some very real thought about how to avoid the dangers that Alexander Meiklejohn and I think all First Amendment devotees really care the most about, which is the danger that the government is going to be censoring, the danger the government is going to be picking our messages. Here, you know, I think that some competition about how to deal with right of reply or fairness would actually be the truly American solution. Let's have competition about it. But at the moment, there's no obligation for anybody to develop anything. I don't think it hurts Breitbart to have a button or a column on the side that says, and for an opposing view, see this? I mean, you know, at the moment, Fox News characterizes what goes on MSNBC and vice versa, but you don't get very much of it. I think it would be interesting to explore, with the limitlessness that the internet provides, just the link that you could have from broadcast. If you want to follow up with a competing view, go here. It doesn't take up very much real estate to do that.
Great. One last follow-up on the fairness doctrine, then I want to go on to the mention of Mueller and its relation to all of this. One kind of worry is about fake news and about the lack of accuracy in media now. Another real worry, contemporary worry, equal worry, is about the rise of hate speech and hate groups. And so I guess I'm just going to ask you how your fairness doctrine might deal with the following problem, which is that in the old doctrine, if you attacked somebody, they had the right of reply. I mean, with that, given the amount of rightful attacks there are on neo-Nazis like Spencer, would that give the neo-Nazis a right of reply in your fairness doctrine, and would that overly amplify their voices?
Sure, fair point. You know, I think at the moment they have plenty of opportunities to be heard, and there aren't actually as many opportunities for them to have a reply. So I'm not so worried about amplifying them.
Yeah.
I think they're plenty amplified, and they have found a way to amplify their messages and not have anyone filter them. You know, if the world changes, but that's not the fear that I have right now. I do think that right of reply may not be the right way to construct a fairness doctrine right now. Diversity may be a way to do it. So Cass Sunstein, my colleague, flirted with reviving the fairness doctrine, and then he rejected it, but he now is interested in a serendipity button, or something that will at least expose each of us to something that our news feed or otherwise would not have generated. I'm not sure I quite understand the mathematics of that or how different views will be characterized, but I do worry about this filter bubble problem more than I do about the hate speech problem.
Yeah. And it would bring, I guess, it's a great point, that it would bring these views in conversation and have them confronted rather than just leave them unanswered.
Exactly.
So I wanted to turn to the aside that you made about Mueller and ask about a different, I think there's the view that you and I share of Meiklejohn that's consistent, I think, with what he said. Free speech protection, but also a defense of democracy was necessary because that's the underlying idea. But the free speech absolutists often cite Meiklejohn. Everybody cites him, not everybody's read him. Unfortunately, it hasn't been published since the 40s, I think, is the last one.
It's online, available.
It's online, you can get it. You can get it in my casebook, actually, on Amazon. But they say the following thing, I think, in opposition to the two of us, which is that Meiklejohn was about the rights of the speaker, but he thought in his famous town meeting metaphor, well, the idea was that we're in a town meeting, we're all debating. If you censor viewpoints, that's going to hinder democracy, partly because of the speaker, but also because of the interests of the listener. And who cares where the speaker is coming from? What matters is that we be able to hear all viewpoints. And in the, I mean, I agree with certainly the idea that we want to keep foreign governments from spreading fake news and undermining our elections. But you can imagine an argument that says the following thing. If we don't care if a viewpoint comes from a corporation because we care about the rights of the listener, why care if it comes from a foreign country? Maybe the Meiklejohn emphasis on the rights of the listener suggests that we're so robust in our ability in a democracy to hear truth and falsity, things that are correct and immoral, that we can reject the wrong views. And so I imagine that they too will, you know, Meiklejohn is one of those figures like Mill that everybody wants to cite, and so I imagine the free speech absolutists against our kind of version of Meiklejohn might say something like that. So what do you say about the rights of the listener?
Well, I guess I would dive in the middle of your comment and to say that foreign entities certainly have a right to speak in the United States. There's nothing that says that the First Amendment is limited to citizens or residents for that matter. However, the non-disclosure of where the message is coming from, that falls into the area of deceit. And when you have Macedonian teenagers pretending to be American voters, that's deception. And that can be regulated, and it should be regulated. So, and I don't think that even the free speech absolutists so far have said no to that. You know, there are people who, I think, without too much exaggeration, describing the free speech absolutism of some commentators and maybe some judges as like Lochner. This is the technique to strike down all government regulation. But when you really push hard at the Supreme Court, you know, there are things they stand up for that have always been with us, like defamation laws, especially if it's against judges. But but particularly understanding that this is a balance. The freedoms that we're committed to are a balance, and they always are a balance. And I think it's not going to be easy. There's not going to be a clear line, but that's what we engage in. And free speech is one of the solutions. Let's have more speech, not less speech. Let's figure out who said it.
The last question, the same thoughts apply to worry about Citizens United and the rights of corporations to speak in ways that might not always be transparent?
Let me go back to your prior question and say, I mean, I have pondered very much Meiklejohn's statement that it's the freedom of speech that's protected, not who said it. You can read it like 10 times, and it's not clear what he's meaning. You know, is there a quantum of views, and if you check those off, you've had all the views, or is there an infinite number of views? Between every view, there's another view. So I don't really understand that, but the part I do think is really worth emphasizing is that what the Constitution protects is the freedom of speech, the freedom of press. It's not all freedoms. And there's a lot of work that can be done there. So Citizens United, you know, there are people who are arguing now that Citizens United guarantees everything that you'd ever need. You don't need to talk about anything ever again. I think that when, you know, Justice Kennedy wrote his own opinion and said, oh, we'll have disclosure. That's going to solve the problem. We'll have the disclosure so we'll know what speech is being paid for by what company. Well, we have a logjam on the Federal Election Commission. We have a logjam in the Federal Trade Commission. We have a logjam in the Securities and Exchange Commission. All the places that could regulate and require the disclosure haven't done so. There's something broken.
Great. Thank you so much for your remarks, and I think we'll open it for questions.
Thanks, Martha.
David.
Really interesting, and I really.
Here, if you could speak into the microphone, we have some colleagues in the
Is that working? Yeah.
and speaking to the microphone will help them hear you.
Okay, thanks. I thought sort of a theme through the talk I appreciated a lot, which you didn't quite put it this way, but I think it's something like this. It's just one theme, but it's it doesn't make any sense to think of these matters from the standpoint of keep government out of it. It doesn't even make sense. It's constructed by government to large degree, not exclusively. So that's absolutely right. And so it's equally obvious then that whatever the solutions are going to be, they're going to be partly by asking what should government's role be. Now, I wonder if it's fair to say, though, that some of your suggestions, I'm not sure it is, were also calling for at least more sympathy for more government powers in this realm. To the extent that that's so, I wonder how much that perspective, which I'm kind of instinctively sympathetic with, is premised on an empirical conjecture that I'm less and less comfortable with, which is who's going to be controlling the agencies and the White House and the Congress 15, 20 years from now? I mean, is this sort of, social democrat position, is it a kind of faith in good government, and would everything change if we lost that faith? And have you lost it? No, I won't go there.
Yeah. When I teach constitutional law, as I do, and I always say, look at this expanding imperial presidency, look at this expanding bureaucracy. You have to think about if it's being exercised by people who don't share your politics. And every year it's a surprise to students. So I share this as a concern. I think it's less of a surprise for some students now than it used to be. But I guess the move that I'm trying to make is a legal realist move, is that it's not like government isn't there, it's all the way through. And so more or less, we can have some debates about it, but it's already there. And so the concerns about abusive government, we have to take care of in some other way than saying you can't have the government intervene, because it's already there. So checks and balances, making sure that we have operating Congress would be helpful, having federalism would be helpful, having a civil society that's vibrant is helpful, having different government agencies that actually come at problems from different directions. I think we have to tend to it that way.
Question.
Hi, nice to talk to you again. I'm Tim Edgar. I teach here at the Watson Institute. Yeah, I guess following up on your question, it seems to me that if you're thinking about the power of the Silicon Valley giants of Facebook and Google, they are the new villains not of the progressive left, but of the right. They are being seen as, it was actually Facebook's being criticized for, being, its algorithm favored liberal news outlets that caused them to kind of overreact. If you look at a recent story in Wired about that, it was a fabulous explanation of it. And I guess the question is, if you vest the power over attention, over our attention, not in those whiz kids in Silicon Valley, but instead in government agencies, why do we think the government is going to make those decisions better? Why do we think that they're going to make them in this disinterested way to favor all the values you and I share more than Mark Zuckerberg is going to make them, or others who actually, despite their profit motive, do have somewhat more progressive values? And isn't that what the freedom of the press is the idea that that process, parts of that process at least, editorial judgments, things like that, are shielded from government action? How would you respond to that concern?
I respond as saying that the editorial judgments now are being made by algorithms to maximize engagement with sites and not disclose the basis upon which they're being made. I'm not suggesting we shift the editorial power to the government, never, but that we actually expect the government to force the disclosure of the decisions that are being made. That's why some of the solutions that I suggest are pretty technical. Share the APIs. It's about enabling the checks and balances to work. It's not about putting the government in an editorial position.
Other questions?
Thank you very much, Martha. Very good. Brian Atwood of the Watson Institute as well. There's another aspect of the First Amendment which I think is more troubling, which is that money in politics is free speech. And that, of course, is why I think Facebook and Google and other huge companies have so much sway in Washington, whereas they don't. As you mentioned, the EU has done better, but possibly because they haven't yet come under that judgment. Looking at your 8 recommendations, how many of those, as you think about them, can be pursued through the courts? How many can be done by executive order, regulation? How many can have to be done by legislation, which of course then makes them vulnerable to the money in politics?
It's of course a great question. I don't think that the courts are the first actor in most of these, but the courts are crucial in not barring them. And many of these steps right now would be under current doctrine, antitrust doctrine, maybe First Amendment doctrine. There would be some obstacles. So I guess I view it as this is going to be multiple parts of the government needing to work together, and it's a message to each of them. As to the EU point, it may be greater insulation from money in politics. It probably is less suspicion of government. I think it explains why the EU regulates, privacy and data protection and a whole lot of things that we don't do. But I went to a meeting recently, International Organization of Engineers, not my usual crowd, that wants to create an ethics dimension of machine learning. This is an interesting moment where it's the engineers who are saying, hey, this stuff that we built is doing stuff we didn't understand, and somebody better pay attention to it. That's the concern that I guess I'm trying to highlight. I don't think that runs into the allergies in the United States to regulation in quite the same way that some of the other concerns in the past have made us diverge from the EU. So at least that's my bet.
I mean, in a way, the town meeting metaphor might help you here in response to the last several questions, because Meiklejohn was worried about regulation of viewpoints and imposition of viewpoint, and you keep emphasizing that. None of your proposals do that. But instead what they do is make possible the forum of speech, and that's exactly what the town metaphor also was meant to do, to say, look, there isn't a natural discussion. The moderator does have to intervene to set time and to keep the meeting moving, and so I think, you're in that tradition.
That's great. Well, a classroom has norms about who gets called on, what order you speak, all of that. Is that a constriction of speech? Yes. Is it a constriction of the freedom of speech? No.
So taking for granted a lot of the current state of the legislative and executive branches, one possible counteraction to the previous question is the effect of public opinion, which was, for instance, critical in defeating the SOPA and PIPA regulation or laws in 2012. A lot of the suggestions that you're proposing are very highly technical, and unless you have a computer science degree, may not be understandable to someone in the general public. So how might you suggest, or how do you think we can rally public opinion to support changes which would otherwise be opposed by big companies and big money?
It is a crucial question, and it's not clear to me that the same techniques that worked then would work now, because you can use bots to flood people's messages and swamp the opposition. However, I think that there is a growing sophistication. Certainly, if you go to people who are your age and younger, about a lot of the issues that I've struggled here to try to understand. And maybe we need better phrases, but people start to see that their news feed has changed, or that their privacy settings were changed without their knowledge. And they didn't need a technical degree to get upset about that. They need a forum in which to express themselves. And so then finding ways in which pretty savvy social movement people can create a context where that dissatisfaction can be heard would be good. I do think that right now, the fact that the terms of service contracts that the digital companies have are not enforced by the digital companies means that self-regulation is not working.
Hi.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed the lecture. One of the proposals that you made about making like the internet essentially like a public utility, I think concerns me a little bit in that we saw with net neutrality how quickly it can just simply be taken away. With the decision of very few, even though there was like outpouring, public support or, for keeping it. So by making it a public utility, do you have any concerns about the fragility or stability of making it of making the internet a public utility, and kind of how that can actually be more regressive towards free speech?
Well, let me see if I understand. It sounded as though your concern is not about being made a public utility, but having the public utility status taken away.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And-
yeah, but more so, like if it becomes a public utility and we're able to regulate it, and because it can be in the hands of just a few decision makers, like we saw with the FCC.
I see.
Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, I mean, what's happened with net neutrality is that the effort to use public utility framework, it's not working. It's not working, right? So that seems not a critique of public utility. That seems a critique of the political will to use it as a framework. So this is going to take some political work. I mean, if the question that you're asking is like one others have put, which is why trust the government, then we need checks and balances on the government. But I think that the public utility model is one that says when there's enormous power, that is contrary to the idea of self-government in the United States. We have at least two tools. One is you regulate that enormous power and say, okay, you can't exploit your monopoly advantage by being unresponsive to consumers. You instead actually have to deliver services and be responsive, and the others to break it up. Those are the tools. We should use them.
I'm a retired journalist, and when I was in the business, the thing I worried about most was the difference between fact and opinion. How does that fit into this ecosystem?
Oh, it's such a powerful question, and thank you for being a journalist. The idea that there was a distinction is historically contingent, right? It really, again, the idea of objectivity in journalism really didn't occur until around the turn of the 20th century. And one of the features that we've had in this country until recently was sufficient competing viewpoints so that you could get a variety of opinions. The moment there is such an elision of any kind of respect for facts at all, that the idea that you can have your own facts seems to have taken over. I love the statement that says you're right to your own opinion, but not your own facts. But people don't even laugh when I say that anymore. So I think it's part of a much larger decline of belief in expertise, belief in science. It's a much larger problem than the one that I'm talking about. I think that it's important to continue to push for that distinction, and I think that it would behoove us to think about pressure, whether it's from consumers or from regulation, to label parts of the media. This is meant to be an opinion piece. This is meant to be news. So that people can at least judge for themselves. And right now, you can't. Indeed, you can't tell whether it was paid for by an ad or not. And so I don't want to imagine that we can always tell what's a fact versus what's an opinion, but there are some facts of the matter, and we should be able to say so.
I'll take a couple more questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. Your description of a new fairness doctrine that would place a responsibility on the searcher to seek out competing views suggests that there is a responsibility held by the news consumer when they're considering news, and certainly some of the other things we've talked about also suggest that there's a responsibility for the news consumer. What do you feel is the responsibility of government through public education, or how do we promote the discriminating consumer that is so desperately needed when you look at the news ecosystem today?
I have had people say to me, I just want people to have different preferences. That's my problem. I think that there is, a tradition of media literacy education that is coming into this new age. And there's more to be done. So media literacy that used to focus on what's the gender bias of ads, for example, now it's focusing on, what is your news feed giving you and how does your search activity affect what you're ending up seeing. And so I think that that's an important part of education, and it should be part of a curriculum. On the other hand, I guess I don't want to imagine that all of the responsibility for breaking out of a filter bubble should be on the consumer. I think that there should be an architecture that makes it easier. I think when you ask people their opinion, a vast majority of people want to hear what other people are saying. Somehow we've set up a system that it's hard to get it. You have to go out of your way, find friends or family who have a very different view. And when there is something going on behind the veil of the algorithms that we can't see, that will accelerate some messages and not others, that makes it hard for people to seek out. So I think it's got to be both. It's got to be public education, but also some pressure, some rules to make the architecture make it easier for people to encounter things that aren't exactly what they read before.
Let's take one last question. I saw it back there. And then we'll continue the conversation. out in the
First, thank
foyer.
you very much. It was terrific.
you.
But I have to ask you, if you look 10 or 20 years from now, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
What are you?
Probably more pessimistic than optimistic. So actually, I guess if you come up with a list of recommendations, that must infer some optimism that people will go in the right direction, but I don't know.
So you've asked the question that is probably the topic most discussed in my household. And I now have an answer. I am a hopeful pessimist.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Minow.